African and Caribbean nations call for slavery tribunal. The establishment of a permanent international court to hear cases involving crimes committed during the transatlantic slave trade is gaining momentum in the African and Caribbean nations, with the endorsement of a United Nations Commission spearheading the initiative. The Nuremberg trials of Nazi war criminals following World War II served as an example of an ad hoc court that was modeled after last year's proposed tribunal. It is now part of a larger reparations campaign for slavery and has gained momentum. The concept of a special tribunal has been discussed at greater length at African and Caribbean regional bodies, according to Eric Phillips, a vice chair of the Slavery Reparations Commission for the Caribbean Community, CARICOM, which comprises 15 member states. The UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent formally proposed the idea in June. A preliminary study by the UN Forum suggested that any tribunal should cover reparations for slavery, apartheid, genocide, and colonialism. However, the scope of such a tribunal has not yet been decided. Phillips stated that proponents are attempting to garner further support for the concept among United Nations members, with offices in CARICOM and the African Union, an organization that unites 55 countries from Africa, among them. The proponents of a unique United Nations tribunal argue that it would be useful in settling complicated international and historical restitution claims by establishing legal standards. Some who are against paying reparations say that modern governments and organizations shouldn't have to pay for slavery that happened a long time ago. It will not be easy to establish an international tribunal for slavery, even among its supporters. When asked about the huge obstacles, Secretary-General Martin Akumu Masiga of the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum, AJJF, an advisory body to the OON on matters of reparations, responded favorably. Challenges include the legal intricacies of identifying culpable parties and establishing remedies, as well as gaining the cooperation of governments that traded in slaves. These things happened many years ago and historical records and evidence can be challenging to access and even verify, said Okumo Masiga. There is still no living witness to the transatlantic slave trade, in contrast to the Nuremberg trials. A representative from the British Foreign Office confirmed that the nation was complicit in transatlantic slavery when questioned about the prospect of a tribunal, but they denied any intention to compensate victims. A more appropriate approach would be to draw lessons from the past and address today's challenges, as the representative put it. Nevertheless, reparations proponents argue that Western nations and institutions should face consequences for perpetuating the wealth that slavery created, especially considering the enduring effects of racial discrimination. An official record of history might be created through a tribunal, according to Zimbabwean lawyer Brian Kagoro, who has been fighting for restitution for more than 20 years. Research conducted by the United Nations has shown that the transatlantic slave trade had far-reaching effects, including the perpetuation of racism, extreme poverty, and economic stagnation across Europe and Africa. These legacies are alive and well, remarked Clive Lewis, a British Labour MP and a descendant of persons enslaved in the Caribbean nation of Grenada. African Americans live in poorer and more polluted areas, they have worse diets, they have worse educational outcomes. Because structural racism is embedded deep. During a reparations summit in Ghana in November, heads of state from Africa and the Caribbean deliberated over the idea of a tribunal. At its conclusion, the Ghana summit promised to investigate potential legal avenues, such as litigation options. Foreign Minister Yusuf Tuggar stated that Nigeria, the most populous nation in Africa, will support the notion of a tribunal until it becomes a reality. Prime Minister Dickon Mitchell of Grenada is in full support, according to a spokeswoman, who described the tribunal as an initiative led by CARICOM. This comes at a time when hundreds of thousands of Grenadians were trapped in slavery. Portugal, Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, and Denmark were among the countries that traded slaves to the Caribbean and other areas. Thus, efforts to establish a tribunal would need to go through the UN system and involve discussions with these nations. U.S. State Department-backed law professor Justin Hansford of Howard University is one of the most outspoken supporters of the tribunal's appointment to the United Nations Forum. The third session of the conference, which begins on April 16 and is expected to be attended by 50 or more governments, will be where the concept will be considered, he said. After that, Hansford will go to Africa to try to get more people to back the idea so that it may be brought up with more support at the United Nations General Assembly in September. The tribunal might take 3 to 5 years to get off the ground, so, a lot of my work now is to try to help make it a reality, he said. The number of African and Caribbean nations that would have likely backed the plan is unknown. However, it is aimed to gather sufficient support by the year 2025. A representative from the U.S. State Department stated that the paying nation will make a decision on the tribunal when it has been developed and established, referring to the United Nations Forum that the U.S. has funded. And the representative went on to say, however, the United States strongly supports the efforts of the conference. Because of the complexity of the issue, legal challenges, and differing perspectives among Caribbean nations present significant challenges, the spokesman expressed concern over reparations. Reparations have been utilized in the past to compensate for substantial moral and financial obligations, such as those owed to families of Holocaust survivors and Japanese Americans detained by the U.S. during World War II, and the current UN leadership has publicly endorsed this practice. In his most forthright remarks on the matter to date, United Nations General Secretary Antonio Guterres stated on March 25 that, "We call for reparatory justice frameworks to help overcome generations of exclusion and discrimination." Regarding the potential tribunal, the Office of Guterres did not react to a request for comment. In response to a question regarding the tribunal, Liz Throssell, spokesperson for the UN Human Rights Office, stated that, "No country with a legacy of enslavement, the trade in enslaved Africans, or colonialism has fully reckoned with the past, or comprehensively accounted for the impacts on the lives of people of African descent today." In an effort to rectify its transatlantic slavery past, the Netherlands established a fund of almost $200 million and issued an apology last year. In response to inquiries, a foreign ministry spokesman stated that the government was unaware of any negotiations involving a tribunal. No remark was made by the French authorities. No comment was received from the Portuguese, Spanish, or Danish governments. According to Akumu Masiga of the Africa Judges and Jurists Forum, one reason for the desire for a tribunal is the view that claims should be codified in a legal framework. Transatlantic slavery was deemed a crime against humanity by multiple authorities, notably the European Union. Special tribunals, which were established by the United Nations after the Nuremberg trials in the 1940s, are criminal courts that are established on an as-needed basis to examine grave international crimes, like crimes against humanity. Since then, two have been formed by the United Nations, one to try individuals for the genocide in Rwanda in 1994 and another to try people for the war crimes perpetrated in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. According to Hansford, a feasible way for a tribunal to be established to compensate for slavery might be through the same process that led to the establishment of the International Criminal Court and the courts for Rwanda and Yugoslavia, two international UN tribunals, ratified by the Security Council. Claiming nations, indigenous communities, and descendants of slaves are all on the table, according to Akumu Masiga, while nations and organizations with ties to slavery's past or even slaveholders' descendants might be named as defendants. According to a source acquainted with the subject at CARICOM, the prime ministers and presidents of the Caribbean nations who met at a summit in February this year suggested collaborating with the O to seek an advisory legal opinion on reparations from the ICJ through the UN General Assembly. Forms Initiatives, a civil society organization based in Accra that collaborates with the African Union on reparatory justice, and its founder, Mahmoud Kamara, stated that the ICJ's advisory would serve as the basis for decision-making. Slave trade began in the 15th century and continued well into the 19th century, with at least 12.5 million Africans trafficked into slavery on ships flying the flags of various countries, mostly Europe but also the United States and Brazil. Britain was the second most active European nation in transporting people before it pushed for the abolition of slavery, with an estimated 3.2 million individuals. The next most active country was Portugal, with approximately 6 million people enslaved. Those who made it through the terrible journey worked inhumanely on plantations throughout the Americas, particularly in Brazil, the Caribbean, and the US, while others reaped the benefits of their labor. The enslaved people themselves were the ones who first called for reparations. They fought wars of resistance, raised their voices in songs of protest, and ran away, stated Vereen A. Shepherd of the University of the West Indies Department for Restitution Research. Rastafarians from the Caribbean and American civil rights icon Martin Luther King, Jr. were among those who came around to supporting the movement later on. Over the last 12 months, a number of the most prominent organizations on the planet have weighed in. The majority of the discourse has centered on trafficking across the Atlantic, ignoring the more ancient trans-Saharan trade that sent an estimated several million enslaved Africans to the Islamic world. It is debatable what actual restitution would entail. The United States is among those that have advocated for direct payments to slaves' descendants. In a strategy put up in 2014, CARICOM requested that European nations help alleviate public health and economic concerns by canceling debt. According to Jasmine Mickens, a social movement strategist based in the US who specializes in reparations, the campaign has gained new momentum due to the EU's intention to join CARICOM. So far as Akumu Masiga is aware, the EU is working on a white paper outlining potential reparations for Africa. We have a global community behind this message, Mickens, who was present at the ceremony in Ghana, stated. That's something this movement has never seen before. The help of South Africa, Senegal, and Nigeria, Ghana rallied African nations to formally seek reparations. Should Western nations be held accountable for their role in sponsoring the slave trade? Who should pay for the wealth that slavery brought to Western institutions? If you have any thoughts, please share them in the comments section. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you would like it and subscribe to my channel so that you may be notified when the next video is posted.